Imagine you're running one of America's biggest record labels, and you have an artist whose last album didn't sell, nor the one before that, and there's no evidence that his next album will sell that well either. And you give him more money to make another record. Crazy? Well, there was once something in the record business called prestige. Back then, a record label could essentially say, well, this artist isn't selling a lot of records, but we're very proud to have him or her on our label. Why would Columbia or Warner Brothers or other major record labels spend money on artists that weren't really making them any money? Well, the answer is simple. Sometimes selling records wasn't the only thing that made an artist valuable to a record label. Prestige gave a record label more credibility. A label didn't want to be perceived as just a factory producing radio hits. Having a Dyke Parks or a Randy Newman or a Cooder made Warner Reprise look like a place where serious musicians wanted to be. And it would also help attract the next Joni Mitchell or Neil Young. The hits subsidized the prestige records. Having one gigantic worldwide hit from Fleetwood Mac enabled the label to put out prestige albums by artists that are maybe only selling 20,000 copies. The label didn't look at each release as an isolated business proposition. Instead, it was really more in the mode of managing a portfolio. And one worldwide hit would enable the chance to have many fascinating failures that could lead to something good down the road. Nobody knew which failure would suddenly become valuable. Randy Newman is a perfect example. His first few albums for Warner Brothers were hardly blockbusters, but eventually his material began to be recorded by other artists, and his stature started to rise and rise till eventually Warner found itself associated with one of America's most respected songwriters that has consistently delivered valuable music. Dyke Parks' first album on Warner, Song Cycle, is a famous failure. Allegedly, it sold less than 10,000 copies. But his value to the label goes far beyond any amount of album sales going through the cash register. Dyke Parks became a very valuable music collaborator to many artists in the record industry, and he was also a very sought-after producer and arranger. It's kind of fun to take a look at Al Kooper. His solo album sales were modest at best. But the guy played organ on Bob Dylan's Like a Rolling Stone. He also put together the legendary Super Session album. He produced numerous acts in the music industry, and that would include signing Leonard Cohen. How many solo albums do you think he needed to sell before Columbia Records thought he was a solid investment? Well, the answer really is you would be measuring the wrong thing if you were thinking that way. Today, an artist that isn't selling on a record label might be called a problem by a record executive. But Warner Brothers called that a loss leader. And they didn't just let the artist sit and hope they would blossom someday. They actively tried to get you to listen to them. And how did they do that? They created a package of albums called Loss Leaders, which were 2 record sets packed with Warner Brothers and Reprise artists, and they were $2, not $2 per record, $2 for 2 records, and you bought them through the mail. Those were a great way to subsidize your musical education, actually. And Warner Brothers was actually selling curiosity. Columbia Records was doing something similar, and I can tell you firsthand, it really worked pretty well. When I was a teenager, I mostly listened to top 40 radio, but then one day, I picked up a low-cost sampler that Columbia put out called the Rock Machine I Love You, and It greatly expanded my universe of music knowledge. Suddenly I was listening to Leonard Cohen, Laura Nyro, Taj Mahal, Mike Bloomfield. The array of artists I had never heard before was mind-boggling, and they were artists that I continued to follow for decades afterwards. It was really an album with a lot of impact for me, and it expanded my musical universe from something this big to something this big. So I was able to discover great music that Top 40 radio wasn't feeding me on a teenager's budget. And record companies were willing to give artists time, sometimes several albums before they'd see if an audience was developing for the performer or not. Today's streaming situation is a completely different equation. A record label can see immediately who's listening and who's gathering all the attention out there. That's a very different world from giving an artist 3 albums and hoping an audience out there discovers them. But here's the delicious irony. The failures won. These certainly weren't the records keeping the lights on at Warner Brothers and Columbia Records, but more than 50 years later, we're still talking about them. And some of the records those labels could barely sell are exactly the records collectors treasure today. Maybe that's what the old record companies understood. Sometimes the record that doesn't make you money today creates the customer who's still buying records half a century later. I know, I became one of them. And maybe Warner Brothers and Columbia understood that not every record needs to be a blockbuster to be worth making. Come to think of it, not every YouTube video needs to be either. So maybe this is my own prestige release. Well, just remember, every record tells a story, and we're certainly planning on bringing you plenty of them. Thanks for listening, and hope to see you again soon.